When Sarah Paulson sat down for a rare interview at 49, no one expected the conversation to turn emotional, or to bring up a name that had defined so much of her early Hollywood journey, Diane Keaton. To many, Diane was the eccentric, charming legend of the silver screen, a symbol of individuality, humor, and heart. But to Sarah, she was much more than that. She was a mentor, a friend, and for a time, the only person in the industry who truly believed in her potential. Their connection began quietly, away from the flashing cameras and scripted lines. Diane had always been known for her warmth and spontaneity, and she took Sarah under her wing during a period when few in Hollywood understood the power of emotional authenticity. Theirs was a bond built on laughter, art, and the courage to be different, a rare friendship in a world that often thrives on competition. But when Sarah finally revealed what really happened to Diane Keaton, why she stepped away from the spotlight, why she seemed so distant in recent years, the truth wasn't scandalous. It was heartbreaking. It was about aging, legacy, and the loneliness that can come with being a Hollywood icon. In this emotional revelation, Sarah Paulson's words painted a portrait not of fame or downfall, but of a woman who gave everything to her craft, only to realize that time can take more than applause ever gives. It began quietly, without the flash of paparazzi or the hum of Hollywood gossip. Sarah Paulson was in her early 30s, still climbing the unpredictable ladder of fame, known in small circles for her emotional honesty on screen. Diane Keaton, on the other hand, was already an institution, the face of Annie Hall, the woman who had charmed and defied Hollywood for decades with her unmatched wit, effortless style, and her refusal to fit into anyone else's mold. They met, as so many Hollywood friendships do, on a film set. But this wasn't the usual mentor-protege relationship. Diane didn't see Sarah as an up-and-comer or a fan. She saw a kindred spirit. "You remind me of myself before the chaos," Diane reportedly told her, with that disarming, mischievous smile she was known for. It wasn't flattery. It was recognition. Diane had always gravitated toward people who carried a quiet complexity, the kind of souls who could make an audience laugh in one scene and break their hearts in the next. Sarah had that same duality. She was fierce and vulnerable, sharp and soft all at once. It wasn't long before Diane took her under her wing, not to teach, but to share. They began meeting off-set, sometimes for long walks, sometimes for coffee at Diane's favorite tucked-away cafe in Beverly Hills. Sarah later recalled that Diane never spoke about acting in the traditional sense. She spoke about life, about observing people, about heartbreak, about the tiny details that make someone real on screen. "Diane taught me that every wrinkle, every hesitation, every silence tells a story," Sarah once said in an interview. She said, "Don't hide from your humanity, use it." That stuck with me. For Diane, those moments of connection were rare. Hollywood had changed. The industry she once knew, full of risk-takers and dreamers, had turned into a machine of franchises and formulas. Sarah reminded her of why she fell in love with acting in the first place. "You have that hunger," Diane told her. "Don't ever lose it. Not for fame. Not for approval." Over time, their friendship deepened into something resembling family. They would laugh over old Hollywood stories, trade secrets about working with legendary directors, and talk about the strange isolation that comes with fame. "Everyone thinks being known means being seen," Diane once told Sarah, "but it's the opposite. The higher you climb, the lonelier the air gets." Sarah would later describe those conversations as life-changing. Diane wasn't just a mentor. She became a mirror, showing Sarah what it meant to stay authentic in an industry that rewards conformity. But as Sarah's career began to ascend, with Emmy-winning performances and growing acclaim, Diane's presence in Hollywood began to fade. She still appeared in occasional projects, still radiated the same quirky brilliance, but something had shifted. She became more reclusive, more private, and eventually she stepped almost completely out of the limelight. To the public, it looked like a graceful retirement. But to Sarah, it felt like a quiet heartbreak. the gradual dimming of one of Hollywood's brightest lights. She gave everything to the craft, Sarah said years later, her voice soft. But I think at some point, the world stopped giving back. Their bond, built on admiration and truth, would soon face its hardest test. When Diane's sudden withdrawal from public life began to raise questions no one seemed able to answer, and when Sarah finally broke her silence about it years later, the truth she revealed was both painful and profoundly human. To the world, Diane Keaton was forever the woman in the wide-brimmed hat, the quirky, brilliant actress whose laughter could light up any screen. Her energy seemed endless, her confidence unshakable. But behind the radiant smile and effortless humor was a woman quietly carrying the weight of time, loss, and the ever-shifting tides of fame. Sarah Paulson began to notice it during their later meetings. Diane, once the life of every conversation, started pausing more often, as if her thoughts were somewhere far away. She would talk about the good old days with a nostalgic warmth, but also with a subtle ache, a longing that hinted at unfinished chapters. "You ever feel like the world just keeps spinning without you?" Diane once asked Sarah during one of their walks. "Like you blink and suddenly you're watching from the sidelines." It wasn't bitterness, it was reflection. Diane had given decades of her life to Hollywood, shaping stories, redefining characters, breaking stereotypes about women, age, and independence. Yet, as she entered her 70s, the calls slowed down. The scripts that once challenged her were replaced with light comedies or supporting roles. It was the unspoken reality of an industry that often forgets its own pioneers once the spotlight shifts. Sarah, by then, was at the height of her career, working with directors Diane had once inspired, starring in roles that carried emotional depth Diane herself had made possible. It was bittersweet, Sarah later admitted. I wanted her to see how much her influence still lived through me. But she was retreating, not because she didn't care, but because she was tired of fighting to be seen. Friends of Diane described her as introspective during that period. She spent more time at home, surrounded by her art, her photography, and her journals, pages filled with musings about love, fame, and the beauty of imperfection. She still laughed, still hosted small dinners, still made everyone feel like the most important person in the room. But behind those bright eyes was a quiet acceptance that life was changing, and she was learning to let go. Sarah often visited her during that time, and their conversations shifted from career talk to life itself. She would talk about her fears of being forgotten, Sarah revealed softly. And I'd tell her, "You could never be forgotten, Diane. You change the way people feel movies." But I think part of her didn't believe it. Fame has a way of making people think they're only as good as their last applause. In those moments, Sarah saw something few ever did, the vulnerability of a legend. Diane wasn't broken. She was simply human. The constant demand to reinvent herself, to keep up with an industry obsessed with youth, had taken a toll. Yet she never complained. She smiled through it all, saying, "I had my time in the sun. Now I'm happy to just watch the light." Still, the quiet sadness lingered. When the public began asking where Diane had gone, Sarah stayed silent, honoring her friend's privacy. But deep down, she knew that Diane wasn't lost. She was simply stepping away on her own terms, choosing peace over pressure. Years later, when Sarah finally spoke about Diane's retreat from the spotlight, her words weren't about loss, they were about love. "She didn't disappear," Sarah said. "She just wanted to live. To be more than her characters, more than the applause. She wanted to be herself." And that was perhaps Diane Keaton's most powerful act of all. Not walking away from Hollywood, but walking toward herself. It happened during an interview that was never meant to be emotional. Sarah Paulson was promoting a new series, another powerhouse performance that had critics raving, when the interviewer casually brought up Diane Keaton's name. "You worked closely with her early in your career," they said. "Do you still keep in touch?" For a moment, Sarah hesitated. The sparkle in her eyes softened into something quieter. Something sacred. She smiled, but it wasn't the usual confident smile the audience knew so well. It was the smile of someone remembering a person who had changed her life. "Yes," she said after a pause. "I do. Or at least I try." The room grew still. Sarah took a deep breath and, for the first time publicly, began to share what had really happened to Diane, not in gossip, not in sadness, but in truth. "Diane never left Hollywood because she couldn't keep up," Sarah said gently. "She left because she had already given it everything she had. There comes a point where you realize you've told every story you were meant to tell, and you want to go live the ones you haven't." She described Diane's decision to step back not as a retreat, but as a conscious act of peace. "She told me once," Sarah continued, "when you spend your whole life pretending to be other people, you start to wonder who you really are. I think I just want to find her again." Sarah admitted that Diane's withdrawal had hurt her at first.